What is the single most terrifying object in the entire Roman Empire? It wasn't the razor-sharp edge of a forged iron gladius. It wasn't the crushing weight of a massive stone thrown by a siege engine. And it certainly wasn't the brutal whip of an unforgiving centurion. It was a simple, damp sea sponge tied securely to the end of a rough wooden stick. Forget absolutely everything Hollywood has ever shown you about the pristine, gleaming, and sterile world of ancient Rome. When modern cinema portrays the unrivaled might of the Roman military machine, it almost exclusively focuses on the flawless, sterilized aesthetics of war. We are constantly shown perfectly polished iron armor reflecting the Mediterranean sun, brilliant red wool cloaks flowing majestically, and breathtaking white marble cities completely devoid of filth or disease. Hollywood presents the Roman legionary as a pristine, robotic instrument of death, entirely separated from the gross, inconvenient, and highly dangerous biological realities of human existence. But to truly understand the sheer terror of the ancient military machine, we must completely shatter this sanitized illusion and step directly into the brutal, deeply unglamorous, and foul-smelling reality of a marching army. A Roman legion was not just a military unit. It was a moving, breathing, sweating, and incredibly dirty temporary city of over 5,000 heavily armed men, accompanied by thousands of horses, mules, and desperate camp followers. When this massive biological organism moved across the harsh landscapes of Gaul or the scorching deserts of North Africa, it generated an astronomical, almost incomprehensible amount of biological waste every single day. Surviving ancient warfare was actually far less about dodging enemy swords and significantly more about surviving the microscopic, invisible enemies that thrived in concentrated human filth. Throughout all of human military history, right up until the era of antibiotics, dysentery, cholera, and typhus, killed vastly more soldiers than any kinetic battle ever did. The Roman military high command, operating with cold, calculating pragmatism, understood this existential biological threat perfectly. They knew that if an army of 5,000 exhausted men simply relieved themselves wherever they pleased, the local water supply would be instantly poisoned, and the entire camp would be dead from violent intestinal disease within a week. Therefore, military sanitation was never considered a matter of personal comfort or human dignity. It was an absolute matter of strict military discipline and sheer collective survival. Every afternoon, after marching for up to 30 punishing kilometers under the suffocating weight of 40 kilograms of gear, the exhausted legionaries were not allowed to rest. Instead, they unlimbered their heavy iron pickaxes, the delabra, and began massive earth-moving operations. The soundscape was filled with the heavy, rhythmic crunch of iron driving into packed earth. And one of the very first, most critical pieces of infrastructure they built was the latrina. But we must not mistake Roman engineering for modern luxury. The reality of using a Roman military latrine was a complete sensory nightmare, a deeply humiliating communal endurance test that stripped away every last ounce of individual privacy. Before we plunge deeper into the suffocating, ammonia-choked darkness of the Roman military latrine, hit that subscribe button and join our legion to uncover the brutal, unfiltered, and deeply uncomfortable history they absolutely refuse to show you in theaters. The physical environment of a Roman latrine, whether in a temporary wooden marching camp surrounded by earthworks or a permanent stone fortress situated on the distant borders of the empire, was designed with ruthless mathematical efficiency and absolutely zero regard for human comfort or privacy. To step inside this structure was to enter a dark, damp, and intensely claustrophobic space that aggressively assaulted every single one of the human senses simultaneously. At its core, the latrine was simply a massive, incredibly deep trench dug straight down into the cold earth, often situated directly over a constantly flowing natural stream of water if the local geography allowed, or manually flushed via complex aqueduct diversions. Above this dark, echoing, and terrifying abyss, the Roman engineers constructed long, continuous wooden benches out of thick, heavy oak planks. These solid timber planks were pierced by a relentless series of keyhole-shaped openings, spaced merely a few inches apart from one another. There were absolutely no dividing walls. There were no individual wooden stalls. There was absolutely no isolation or personal space of any kind. When a heavily armored legionary needed to relieve himself, he was forced to sit literally shoulder to shoulder, thigh to thigh with dozens of his fellow exhausted soldiers. You could physically feel the uncomfortable body heat radiating powerfully through the damp, sweat-soaked wool tunics of the men pressed tightly beside you in the dim light. The acoustic environment inside these long, low-ceilinged wooden or stone structures was a terrifying cacophony of horrific, highly textured ASMR. The stagnant air was thick with the deep, echoing sounds of rushing water deep below in the dark trenches, perfectly mixed with the heavy, collective grunts of exhausted men. You would hear the continuous, highly abrasive metallic clinking of cold iron hobnailed Callagee boots shifting uneasily on wet, slippery stone floors, and the rough, dry rustle of coarse wool garments being hitched up over heavily muscled legs. But the absolute most overwhelming aspect of the entire horrific experience was the smell. The unventilated air inside the latrine was thick, heavy, and deeply stagnant, completely saturated with the suffocating, eye-watering stench of pure concentrated ammonia, raw rotting human waste, and damp, decaying timber. In the sweltering heat of the Mediterranean summer months, these dark latrines rapidly became a perfect breeding ground for thick, vibrating clouds of massive, aggressively buzzing flies that swarmed relentlessly over the vulnerable, exposed flesh of the soldiers. It was the space of extreme psychological compression. A hardened veteran who had just stood bravely in a bloody shield wall against barbarians was instantly reduced to sitting entirely exposed over a dark, foul-smelling hole, completely stripped of any modern personal dignity. The cold military logic was undeniably sound, but the daily reality required the total suppression of disgust. If the absolute lack of privacy and the suffocating, burning stench of ammonia were not enough to completely terrify the modern mind, the actual physical, tactile mechanics of Roman hygiene present the most shocking and visceral revelation of all. Soft, disposable toilet paper is a profoundly modern luxury that we entirely take for granted. The ancient Romans, despite their vast architectural marvels, their sprawling aqueducts, and their incredibly complex legal systems, relied on a specific sanitary tool that instantly induces visceral, stomach-churning horror in anyone who understands even the most basic principles of modern germ theory: the xylospongium. also commonly known as the tersorium. It was, quite literally and simply, a piece of natural sea sponge tied securely to the end of a short, rough wooden stick. However, the true, unadulterated horror did not lie in the physical tool itself, but in its brutal, deeply unhygienic communal application. A Roman soldier absolutely did not carry his own personal, clean sponge in his heavy marching pack. The xylospongium was strict public property, a shared, heavily used tool permanently chained to the wall or left resting on the damp floor in the latrine for the entire military cohort to use, one after another. Running continuously along the stone ground directly in front of the long wooden seating benches was a narrow, shallow gutter meticulously carved into the rock, through which a steady stream of relatively clean water flowed. When a soldier was finally finished, he would reach down into the dim light, grab the wet, communal stick, and perform the necessary cleaning. The localized soundscape of this specific action is pure, visceral audio horror. The highly textured, thick, and wet squelching of a completely soaked sea sponge being heavily compressed against human skin, followed instantly by the dry, abrasive scrape of the wooden handle, knocking against the edge of the oak bench. Once used, the strict military protocol was to thoroughly rinse the heavily soiled, dripping sponge in the narrow gutter of running water directly at their feet. To mitigate the incredibly obvious biological catastrophe that this system created, the Romans provided deep bronze or terracotta buckets filled to the brim with highly concentrated saltwater brine, or extremely pungent, sour, and highly acidic military vinegar. The soldier was supposed to aggressively plunge the sponge into this harsh, acidic mixture to disinfect it for the very next man sitting intimately beside him. You had to trust your very life and the delicate health of your digestive system entirely to the thoroughness of the exhausted, uneducated farm boy who used the exact same sponge mere seconds before you did. The physical sensation of grasping a cold, damp, and highly questionable wooden stick, completely saturated with the harsh smell of sour vinegar and the lingering, undeniable reality of the previous user's biology, is an absolute tactile nightmare. It was the ultimate, inescapable expression of the Roman military machine. You were merely a microscopic, disposable cog in a massive organism, sharing absolutely everything from your hard rations to your deadly intestinal diseases. The deep psychological terror of the Roman military latrine extended far beyond the immediate visceral disgust of the communal xylospongium. Entering this dark space was actively, physically dangerous to a legionary's life, because these massive, incredibly deep trenches collected and concentrated the raw biological waste of thousands of men over weeks or months. They acted as massive chemical reactors. They generated huge, invisible, and highly concentrated clouds of incredibly toxic and highly flammable gases, primarily hydrogen sulfide and volatile methane. Because the sprawling latrine structures were intentionally built deep, dark, and largely unlit by natural sunlight, soldiers entering the facility at night would frequently bring small terracotta oil lamps or burning wooden torches just to see where to step. The terrifying results of introducing an open flame into a concentrated methane environment were catastrophic. Trapped, invisible pockets of methane gas hovering just below the wooden seats would suddenly and violently ignite. This caused aggressive, explosive columns of roaring fire to shoot straight up through the keyhole openings in the oak benches, instantly and severely burning the highly exposed, incredibly vulnerable flesh of the soldiers sitting directly above the blast. The Romans, entirely lacking any modern understanding of volatile chemistry or gas buildup, frequently and genuinely attributed these sudden, horrific explosions to angry, subterranean demons or malevolent spirits dwelling in the dark abyss of the trench. Furthermore, the deep, damp, and heavily soiled trenches were an absolute, undeniable paradise for dangerous vermin. It was a terrifyingly common occurrence for massive, aggressive rats, or even venomous snakes desperately seeking warmth and food, to crawl silently up the rough timber supports from the absolute darkness below and violently bite the completely exposed legionaries in the most sensitive areas imaginable. To combat this deeply ingrained underlying terror, the Romans literally prayed to a specific, dedicated deity, Cloacina, the official goddess of the sewer and the latrine, begging for safe passage through the daily bodily chore. But despite the very real threat of methane explosions, the aggressive vermin in the dark, and the utterly terrifying biological reality of the shared sponge, the Roman sanitary system functioned with brutal, undeniable mathematical efficiency. The Romans did not understand microscopic bacteria, but they inherently understood the macro statistics of army survival. By strictly forcing every single man to use the centralized latrines under threat of severe punishment, and by utilizing the naturally antibacterial properties of highly concentrated vinegar on the communal sponges, they successfully kept the vast majority of the lethal human waste completely separated from the army's vital drinking water supply. It was a horrific, deeply disgusting compromise, but it allowed Rome to forcefully project military power across the known world without their armies rotting from the inside out. The xylospongium and the dark, echoing latrines serve as a powerful reminder that the foundations of the greatest empire in antiquity were not just built on gleaming marble and disciplined steel. They were built squarely on the grim, stomach-churning ability of exhausted men to endure the absolute worst aspects of human biology, sacrificing personal dignity every single day in the name of collective, ruthless survival.